The number finally crossed a line that millions of retirees had been waiting years to see. For the first time ever, the average Social Security check pushed past $2,000 a month. After years of watching prices climb, that moment felt like validation, a system working, a promise holding, a sign that maybe things were starting to catch up. A jazz here, coming from a background in finance at the master's level, and moments like this might look reassuring at first glance, but the deeper numbers tell a very different story. And then reality stepped in almost immediately, because that milestone wasn't the victory it looked like, it was the setup. That $2,000 check came with a 2.8% increase in 2026, adding about $56 to the average monthly benefit. On paper, that sounds reasonable. $56 is not nothing. It's a utility bill, a week of groceries, maybe a little breathing room. But that number doesn't live on paper, it lives in the real world. And in that same real world, something else happened at the exact same time. Medicare Part B premiums jumped to $202.90 per month, an increase of $17.90. That increase alone quietly erased nearly a third of the so-called raise before it even had a chance to land. Now take a step back and look at what just happened. A retiree gets told there's more money coming in. The deposit hits the account. It feels like progress. But before that money can even be used, a chunk of it is already gone. Not spent, not chosen, gone. And that's before food, housing, prescriptions, or anything else enters the picture. This is where the story really begins, because what's happening here isn't just about 1 year. It's about how the entire system calculates reality, and how that calculation quietly drifts further and further away from what retirees actually experience. The annual increase, known as the cost of living adjustment, is tied to something called the Consumer Price Index for urban wage earners and clerical workers, CPIW. It's a long name for a simple idea. Track inflation, then adjust benefits so they keep up. But there's a catch hidden right inside the name. Urban wage earners, clerical workers, not retirees, not people living on fixed incomes, not people whose biggest expenses are healthcare, prescriptions, and housing stability. The system is measuring inflation based on how working-age people spend money. And then it's applying that measurement to people whose financial lives look completely different. That gap is where everything starts to break. Imagine a typical day for someone living entirely on Social Security. Not an abstract person, a real one. Let's call her Evelyn. Evelyn is 72 years old, retired for a decade, lives in a modest apartment, no extravagant lifestyle, no unnecessary spending, just the basics, carefully managed. The deposit hits her account at the start of the month. It's slightly higher than last year. That $56 increase is there. For a moment, it feels like relief. Then the deductions hit. Medicare pulls its premium automatically. $202.90. Higher than last year. No negotiation. No delay. Just like that, the raise shrinks. Evelyn doesn't think about percentages. She thinks about what's left. Next comes the grocery trip. Nothing fancy, just the usual list. Bread, eggs, milk, some fresh produce, maybe a small treat if prices allow it. But something has changed. Prices haven't just gone up once. They've been climbing consistently. A few cents here, a dollar there. It adds up in a way that's hard to see in headlines but impossible to ignore at checkout. That $56 increase starts disappearing faster than expected. Then there's healthcare beyond the premium. Copays, medications, occasional doctor visits. Even with coverage, the out-of-pocket costs creep higher. And here's the key detail that rarely gets talked about clearly. Healthcare inflation doesn't move at the same pace as general inflation. It tends to rise faster, which means even if the official inflation number looks moderate, the categories that matter most to retirees are often increasing more aggressively. So while CPIW might suggest things are stable, Evelyn's reality tells a different story. By the middle of the month, the numbers don't lie. That increase is gone. Not wasted, not mismanaged, absorbed. And that's 2026. Now shift the focus forward, because the real concern isn't what just happened. It's what might happen next. Early projections for 2027 are already raising eyebrows. Some analysts expect a cost of living adjustment similar to 2026. Others see something very different. One projection puts the increase as low as 1.2%. At first glance, that might not sound alarming. Inflation is cooling, right? Smaller increases could mean things are stabilizing. But that assumption only works if the measurement matches reality, and this is where the situation becomes more serious. A 1.2% increase on a $2,000 monthly benefit is about $24. That's the raise. $24. Now place that next to the existing Medicare premium of $202.90. Not a projection, not a guess. That's already the baseline. Even if that premium doesn't increase further, which history suggests is unlikely, the math is already tight. $24 doesn't stretch far. It barely moves the needle against rising costs. And if healthcare, food, or housing continue to climb at even modest rates, that increase doesn't just feel small. It becomes negative in real terms. That's the moment where a raise turns into a pay cut. Not officially, not on paper, but in lived experience. And that distinction matters more than anything else because the system will still say benefits increased. The percentage will be there. The announcement will sound positive, but the purchasing power tells the real story. What that money can actually do, what it can actually cover. That's where the gap becomes impossible to ignore. Back in Evelyn's world, that gap shows up in small decisions. Decisions that don't make headlines but shape everyday life. Choosing between fresh produce and cheaper alternatives, delaying a prescription refill by a few days, keeping the thermostat a little lower. None of these choices look dramatic on their own, but together they paint a clear picture. The system says things are improving. Life says something else. And this disconnect doesn't come from a single policy or a single year. It's built into the structure. CPIW gives less weight to healthcare compared to what retirees actually spend. It reflects commuting costs, apparel, and other expenses that matter more to working populations. So when gas prices drop or certain goods stabilize, the index can show lower inflation even if medical costs continue climbing. That creates a scenario where the official number looks manageable, but the reality for retirees feels anything but. And this isn't just theory. The data supports it. Healthcare costs have consistently outpaced general inflation over time. Medicare premiums, deductibles, and out-of-pocket expenses continue to rise. Even hospital-related costs, like the Part A deductible reaching $1,736 in 2026, add another layer of financial pressure. These are not occasional spikes. They're part of a broader trend. So when a smaller COLA is projected, it doesn't just reflect cooling inflation. It reflects a measurement system that may not fully capture the pressures retirees face most. That's why the 2027 projection matters so much. It's not just a number. It's a signal. A signal that the gap between official inflation and real-world costs could widen even further. And when that happens, the impact compounds. A smaller increase one year doesn't just affect that year. It sets a lower base for future increases. Over time, that can significantly erode purchasing power. What looks like a minor adjustment in the short term becomes a meaningful loss over the long term. That's the quiet part of this story. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, month by month, year by year, until one day the numbers don't add up anymore. And that's where the conversation needs to shift. Because this isn't just about whether a raise is big or small, it's about whether the system measuring that raise reflects reality. If the benchmark doesn't match the experience, the adjustment will always fall short. And that's exactly what's starting to show. The 2026 increase created a moment of optimism. Crossing $2,000 felt like progress. But the way that increase was absorbed revealed something deeper. It showed how fragile that progress really is. And with 2027 on the horizon, that fragility is becoming harder to ignore. Now zoom out for a second and look at the bigger pattern forming, because what's happening isn't just a one-year mismatch or a temporary squeeze. It's something much more structural, something baked into how these adjustments are calculated in the first place. The cost of living adjustment is supposed to protect retirees from inflation, but the way it does that relies entirely on CPIW, a measurement designed around the spending habits of working individuals, not retirees. That difference might sound small at first, but in practice, it creates a slow and steady distortion. Working individuals spend more on transportation, apparel, and job-related expenses, while retirees spend a much larger share on healthcare, housing stability, and basic necessities. So in certain categories like fuel or consumer goods stabilize or drop, CPIW reflects that relief. But retirees don't feel that same relief if their biggest expenses, like medical care, continue climbing. And that's exactly what has been happening. This is where the idea of real inflation starts to matter more than the official number. Because inflation isn't just a percentage printed in a report, it's what everyday life costs. It's what it takes to maintain the same standard of living from one year to the next. And for retirees, that standard is being squeezed from multiple directions at once. Housing costs don't pause. Food prices rarely move backward in a meaningful way. And healthcare, more than anything else, continues to rise at a pace that outstrips general inflation. So even if the official rate comes in lower, even if headlines suggest things are cooling, the lived experience tells a different story. The gap between those two realities is where the problem grows. Go back to Evelyn for a moment, because this is where numbers turn into something tangible. By the time the second half of the month arrives, the initial optimism from that deposit has completely faded. The increase that once felt like progress has already been absorbed into the system of expenses that never stop moving. The Medicare premium took its share immediately, reducing the benefit before it even had a chance to be used. Groceries chipped away at the rest, not in a dramatic spike, but in a steady accumulation of higher prices that quietly add pressure. Then come the smaller, less predictable costs. A prescription that costs slightly more than last time, a utility bill that edges higher, a routine doctor visit that adds another copay into the mix. None of these moments feel catastrophic on their own, but together they form a pattern that's impossible to ignore. By the end of the month, the numbers aren't just tight, they're stretched. And this is where the idea of a 1.2% increase for 2027 becomes more than just a projection. It becomes a warning. Because if a $56 increase in 2026 could barely hold its ground against rising costs, what does a roughly $24 increase actually accomplish? That smaller adjustment doesn't exist in isolation. It comes on top of an already elevated cost structure. Medicare premiums have already climbed to $202.90, deductibles have increased, and the broader trend in healthcare costs continues upward. So even before new increases are introduced, the baseline itself is heavier. That means a smaller COLA doesn't just feel smaller, it lands in a more demanding environment. And that's the part that often gets missed in surface-level discussions. A percentage doesn't tell the full story unless it's placed against what people are actually paying. A 1.2% increase might sound reasonable in a low-inflation environment, but if essential costs are still rising faster than that, the math doesn't work. It creates a situation where benefits technically go up, but purchasing power goes down. And that's the definition of a real pay cut, even if it's never labeled that way. There's also a psychological layer to all of this that doesn't get talked about enough. When increases are announced, they're framed as positive developments, and technically they are increases. But when those increases fail to translate into real-world relief, it creates a sense of confusion and frustration. The system says things are improving, but everyday experience says otherwise. That disconnect isn't just financial, it's emotional. It changes how people plan, how they spend, and how secure they feel about the future. And over time, that erosion of confidence can be just as impactful as the financial strain itself. Now, bring the focus back to the long-term picture, because this is where the stakes become even clearer. Each year's adjustment doesn't just affect that year, it compounds. A smaller increase today becomes part of the base for tomorrow's increase. So if adjustments consistently lag behind real costs, the gap widens over time. What starts as a small difference can turn into a significant loss in purchasing power across several years. And that's not something that can be easily corrected later, because the system builds on itself. Once that ground is lost, it's difficult to regain. Meanwhile, the expenses that matter most don't operate on that same delayed timeline. Healthcare costs don't wait for adjustments to catch up. Housing doesn't pause. Food prices don't reset to match benefit increases. They move independently, often faster, and always forward. So retirees are left navigating a system where income adjustments trail behind expense realities, creating a constant state of catch-up that never quite closes the gap. And this brings everything back to that moment at the beginning, when the average benefit crossed $2,000 for the first time. It looked like a milestone. It sounded like progress, but in reality it may have marked the point where the gap became too large to ignore. Because what matters isn't the size of the check in isolation. It's what that check can actually do. It's how far it stretches. And if that distance keeps shrinking, then the number itself becomes less meaningful. The conversation around Social Security often focuses on sustainability, trust funds, and long-term projections. Those are important discussions. But for the people living on these benefits right now, the issue is much more immediate. It's about whether the system keeps up with reality, whether the adjustments reflect the costs that actually matter, whether a raise feels like a raise when it shows up. Right now, the answer to that question is becoming harder to justify, because when a $56 increase gets absorbed almost instantly and the next increase might be less than half of that, the pattern becomes clear. The system isn't necessarily failing in a dramatic way. It's drifting quietly, gradually, but consistently enough to be felt. And that's why the term scam starts to resonate, not as a literal accusation, but as a reflection of how the experience feels from the outside. Something is being promised, something is being delivered, but the outcome doesn't match the expectation. The numbers say one thing, but reality delivers another. So as 2027 approaches, the question isn't just how big the next adjustment will be. The real question is whether that adjustment will actually make a difference, whether it will restore purchasing power or continue the pattern of erosion, whether it will close the gap or widen it further. Because at the end of the day, this isn't about percentages or projections, it's about everyday life. It's about whether that monthly check can cover what it needs to cover without forcing constant trade-offs. And if the answer to that keeps drifting further away, then even the smallest changes start to matter a lot more. That's the reality behind the numbers. That's the story behind the headlines. And that's why what looks like a raise on paper can feel like something very different in real life. If this breakdown made things clear, share it with someone who needs to see it, because this is the kind of issue that affects millions but often gets explained in a way that misses the real impact. And for anyone trying to stay ahead of changes like this, staying informed is the only real advantage. Subscribe for more deep dives that turn complicated systems into something understandable, because the more clarity there is, the easier it becomes to navigate what's coming next.